Hello, everyone. I'm Aaron Grizel, Martin Luther King Foundation, and we are, again, delighted to be partnered with the Episcopal Diocese of California and with the Grace Cathedral community to present our 5th installment of this wonderful King and Faith Forum. It helps us to stretch our thought and stretch our imaginations and stretch our comfort zones. That's what this particular engagement is about each year. This year's theme for the Martin Luther King celebrations here in San Francisco this year is the time for justice. And so we're reflecting on that during this forum with 4 distinguished persons. To my immediate left is someone that we all know and love. He's our Right Reverend Bishop Marc Handley Andrus. He will be moderating our discussion today. He's also a King Scholar. We are partners in crime in that respect. He studying Thich Nhat Hanh and the relationship between King and Thich Nhat Hanh, which is going to be a very important piece in the puzzle to help us understand further as academics and as a general public what that relationship meant and means throughout the world. To his left, we have Dr. Munir Jiwa, who's the founding director of the Center for Islamic Studies and associate professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology at the Graduate Theological Union. And he's also the associate professor of Islamic Studies and Anthropology at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. Dr. Jiwa took his PhD his PhD from Columbia University in the city of New York. He comes just north of us at Simon Fraser University, where he took his bachelor's degree. To his left is the incomparable Dr. Mary Wardell Giraduzzi, who's the Vice Provost of Diversity and Engagement and Community and Outreach and Associate Professor of Organizations, Communications, and Leadership at the University of San Francisco. She's also one of our civic leaders here in this wonderful city, serving previously as library. I think you're still the chair of the Library Commission, which in 2018, under her leadership and stewardship, they were the Library of the Year. And that's certainly an achievement. And to Mary's left is the Reverend Dr. Dorsey Odell Blake. Dr. Blake is the senior minister of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples, the church that was co-founded by Dr. King's mentor, the Dr. Howard Thurman, who in 1944 came here determined to create and help to create the first intentionally interracial and interreligious and interfaith congregation in these United States. He thought that that experiment could work, and it's still working and helping to promulgate throughout this country to help to desegregate the most segregated hours still in these United States. He's also a faculty associate and a longtime beloved professor of leadership and social transformation at the Pacific School of Religion there in Berkeley, and he's the board chair of IDA, a social networking platform that seeks to empower women and communities of color most affected by today's economic crisis. So these are the 3 who will be in conversation with Bishop Marc on this theme, the time for justice. Let's give them all a hand.
Well, I want to start by asking all of us to warmly thank Aaron and Malcolm and all the folks over here at Grace Cathedral for making this possible. Thank you. Aaron is indefatigable in this work of keeping the witness of peace and justice refracted through the life of Martin Luther King Jr. in front of all of us. And it's such a pleasure to get to work in his ambit. Dr. Wardell Giarduzzi, I just wanted to make sure you saw I've got my library card here
awesome.
with me.
I want to make sure everybody in this room has their San Francisco Public Library
I use
card.
it all the time. We live half a block from one of the branch libraries.
Yes.
And I've been writing my dissertation largely in the library.
Well, you know that's what it's for.
Really great. And I'll just embroidering just for a moment. The first of the early books of Thich Nhat Hanh's that I read was called Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, which was his book. He wrote first in Vietnam to help the Vietnamese people understand the war, but then it was translated into English to help us understand the war. And it was the first edition that's there in the main library, and it's an artifact of that time, of the Vietnam War. It is filled with marginalia where people are commenting, no, the CIA's behind this, and then the back pages are all covered with Vietnamese script, which I have not had translated.
Yeah.
But, the best library.
Well,
Wonderful.
actually, the San Francisco Public Library is the official collector of the city of San Francisco's treasures in many ways. So documents, photographs, books, and much more. And so people do not understand how significant of an institution and how important the library is to the city and county and to the residents and everybody that has lived in the past, people in the present, and really what we're doing to document the stories of people so that they're not lost.
We are deeply grateful to you.
Absolutely.
So a moderator, what an interesting title. It kind of implies that things are going to be heated up and that I have to kind of simmer them down a little bit, and that's what I hope is going to be the case, right? This is an amazingly capacious panel of committed and highly trained and gifted people. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Blake. I'm not, Aaron, I was using more of what you wrote about peace and obnoxious peace than the theme of just a time for justice. So I'm really emphasizing that idea. Dr. Blake, like your co-panelists, you have a rich history of promoting justice from within academic institutions and through the process of education, teaching itself. You have also, however, held the pastorate at the uniquely important Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples since 1994. That's an amazing pastorate. It is in the context, then, of a congregation and its life that I'd like you to address the question of peace and obnoxious peace. Have you sought to carry forward, how have you sought to carry forward the Reverend Dr. Thurman's vision of the beloved community? And how have you found places of creative acceptance for that vision in the congregation? And where have you met obstacles? And how did you deal with them? I'd really like to know the last part.
I think it would be very important to give some context for the creation of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. We're talking about 1944, where even in California, everything was segregated. Right? So the first thing is to understand that there was a vision about this church coming into being. Initially, it was Dr. Alfred Fisk, who was a white professor at San Francisco State College at the time. And he had worked with a group of people trying to bring, he was Presbyterian, an interracial congregation within the Presbyterian Church. He was convinced that in order to be truly interracial, the leadership had to be interracial. Okay. There were churches where a few black people or Koreans, whatever, could attend, but that was not his understanding of interracial fellowship. It had to be throughout leadership. And so it was, in terms of the co-pastorship between Dr. Fisk and Dr. Thurman. The board was totally interracial. The congregation was interracial. It was also at the time seen not only in terms of religious context, but as a statement of civil or human rights. Some of the people behind it were people like people with CORE, people who were the great civil rights leader, Bayard Rustin. Mm-hmm. They saw this as a powerful way to make a statement about how people should live. It was about breaking the barriers down that separated one person from another. It intentionally said, not that we're just going to tolerate people from various backgrounds, but we want people from all nationalities, racial groups, gender groups, because the idea, and this is how we've been trying to, if they come together for a sufficient time duration and have deep religious experiences, those experiences are more powerful than the things that separate, and it would help to dissolve those barriers, not in terms of our identities, but the walls between people, the barriers that separate people. So that was the idea. That, in 1944, was absolutely radical. In fact, when Dr. Fisk was looking for somebody to co-pastor, a letter went to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Dr. Thurman was the first black member of that board, A.J. Muskie. And Muskie got the letter and sent it to Dr. Thurman and said they're looking for a young black fellow to be the co-pastor with Dr. Fisk. And what happened was they realized that, well, they wanted probably a young, real young person, maybe a seminarian, because they weren't paying very much. And they were saying that nobody who really has a family is going to come and accept it for this low salary. And Dr. Thurman looked at it and said, this might be the answer to what he experienced in Khyber Pass. This is a long way to answer your question.
No, we're with you.
At Khyber Pass. What had happened in 1935 and 36, Dr. Thurman and his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and two other people, the Carrolls, were part of an pilgrimage, interreligious faith pilgrimage to, at that time, Ceylon, Burma, and India. It was sort of like the first exposure coming from Thurman's deep understanding of religion in that area. Okay. It was where, in many ways, they had an audience, well, they had an audience with Mahatma Gandhi as they were leaving in 36. And they talked about nonviolence at the gathering. Mahatma Gandhi, I have to do this, Mahatma Gandhi said to the Thurmans, it may be through the, at the time, American Negro that nonviolence would have its greatest exposition. 1936. Martin Luther King was only 7 years old then. Okay. One of the connections is that Dr. Thurman and Martin Luther King's father were at Morehouse at the same time studying, different places, but same time. Mrs. Thurman and King's mother knew each other. They were in high school together. So when Dr. Thurman came back, he certainly influenced Martin Luther King, but the point about that is when the Thurmans left, they went through Khyber Pass, and they saw merchants from various backgrounds coming together through Khyber Pass. And Thurman said, there must be a way. Why can't religious people from various backgrounds come together? And so when the idea of this church came to his desk, he goes, this may be the answer to what I have been searching for. That is a religious community, a fellowship where all peoples are respected and we respect all the traditions. Because later he said, what is true in religion is true because it's true. It is not true because it's in that particular religion. And so there is this kind of commonality they talk about among the religions. What we have tried to do we're 75 years old now, we survived, has been to try to understand that in terms of our present day realities. How do we bring people together in terms of our present day reality? One is by being very open and very welcoming and understanding the integrity of each person who comes to the church. So we have now, it's a very small congregation, but there are Jews, Buddhists, Christians, people who had no religious background, but are just drawn by this idea of the fellowship of all peoples. One of the ways we maintain that, and I'm very happy to say we have one of our former secretaries and board members here, Paula Guillory. One of the ways we maintain that is through our fellowship hour, which is after church, when people sit down together and eat and talk. And that builds a great sense of community. For example, several years ago, we had at the church an intern from one of the seminary, PSR. And part of the internship is you have to evaluate them, and they evaluate you, their experience. And so I was pretty confident about what we had done in terms of the sermons and all these kinds of things and so on. But I had a full-time position at that time at the GTU, and so did my co-minister. And we were saying, well, my God, she's going to mark us down when it comes to pastoral care. Because we've got these, we just didn't have a lot of time to do the pastoral care piece. And when I read her comments, I was bowled over. She said they had the most unique pastoral care. And she said it happens after the service, when people sit and talk with each other, and they go deep a lot of times. People have changed their careers as a result of being after church and talking and saying, well, I don't know if I should take that position. Well, maybe you should, and that kind of thing. So one of the ways we have maintained, and I'll quit. One of the ways we maintain, I think, that kind of understanding really has been through the fact of what happens after church. And within the service, we respect all faith traditions. We've had people from all faith traditions speak at the church. We have, again, several members who are Buddhists. We have a fellow who's Jewish, one of our co-ministers. So it's really being open and being able to risk. Now, you asked for some of the problems. Some of the challenges have been at times, I think, people, because we are so open, that can sometimes be problematic. There needs to be some kind of foundation. And sometimes people come just because it's so open and so wonderful, blah, 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 and they do not realize, but there must be a foundation. There must be something you believe in order to be part of that. So we have a saying that we read every Sunday. The reason for that is Dr. Thurman also said, you must be at home somewhere in order to be at home everywhere. So you have to have some kind of understanding, some type of tradition. And that has been part of the challenge. Sometimes people come in, and then sometimes people come in and say, oh, what kind of church is this? We're not doing the regular church thing. So there are problems because
Hallelujah.
What's that? But they want the traditional. They really do. And for example, this time we don't have a choir. We have wonderful music, but not a choir. Some people want a choir. Why don't you have a choir? And these various things. So it's the fact that we're non-traditional that really is problematic for a lot of people. And my point is that's okay because there are plenty of traditional churches. If this doesn't work for you, fine. One person said, one day I was at a meeting and I was talking about the church, and she said, well, what kind of Bible y'all use? Because we have used insights. One of my favorite people is Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet. So we've used insights from Tagore, from Howard Thurman, from Langston Hughes, from Audre Lorde, from these, as part of the fact that people have been raising questions, deep spiritual questions, in many forms and many places. And again, if it's true, we have the right to use it, and we do. So, sorry it takes so long.
No, that was beautiful. There's so many places of entry in what you said, but the very last, we have this Episcopal congregation on Potrero Hill St. Gregory of Nyssa.
Oh, yes.
Have you been inside?
Nobody said it's gorgeous.
Well, it's so unique. Have any of you been there? Yeah, many. So it's
Yes,
part
I've
of
heard
it's
that.
round,
Yes.
and they've got 2 ranks of saints,
Yes.
icon. They're larger than life, but none of them are. One of the criteria for who's on the wall is they can't be actual saints.
Ah,
So you've got all these unexpected people, and people find their identity in the unexpected. And so they had the installation dinner before my installation here at
Yes.
Grace Cathedral there. My mother, who was raised during the Depression, thought Eleanor Roosevelt was the greatest person on earth, and there she is on the wall. And my mother started weeping when she saw her.
yes.
So lifting up the works that are not sacred scriptures, like Tagore and Audre Lorde and others, but lifting them up the way you're lifting them up is telling people this, which I think is important to you. And that seems very important to me. That's great.
Just quickly, Elder Roosevelt was involved in the founding of the church also. She was in Washington, D.C. The Thurmans were in Washington, D.C. before they moved out here. And she put together a dinner, a going-away dinner for the Thurmans. And she was one of the people, one of the first signers. We have members at large, and she was one of the first signers as a member.
Well, that's
The
something
following
to be
year,
very
she came
proud
out
of.
here and helped to establish United Nations.
Wow.
Yes, which is having its 75th anniversary
Yeah.
Yes.
in June.
I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Wardell
Yes.
Giarduzzi, and focus on peace and obnoxious peace in the academy.
Yes.
Specifically, you teach in a special university that holds to long-standing humanities values, including theology in
Yes.
higher education. And you've got a special role in that in terms of promoting dignity for all and inclusion for all.
Yes.
A core argument of universities such as yours is that spiritual and moral formation is essential for the maintenance of free, just, and peaceful societies. Can you give us some examples of how your university has been successful at promoting peace and justice? And where has the university struggled on these same efforts?
Well, thank you for that question. You know that the Jesuit educational tradition is a 500-year tradition, and we have been trying to disrupt traditional education in many ways, and saying that faith and reason are not at odds with each other, that one can have deep faith and actually no faith at all, and at the same time be committed to the highest standards of scientific inquiry, as well as artistic expression and exploration, and that we both have both a duty and an obligation as educated people, as citizens, to understand that those two married together is really how we go about embodying a better society and a better world. And so I've been involved in higher education in California for the last 25 years in both public and private higher education. I came to the University of San Francisco, where I'm currently at, in 2008. And the role that I came to at that particular time, my portfolio, I was an associate vice president and dean of students, and so my job was to be the university administrator that ensured that there was a wholeness in the student experience. So once the students arrived, whether they came from a community college, whether they transferred from another university, whether they were returning for additional education, undergraduate, graduate, and professional students, our role was to ensure that these students had an educational experience that fulfilled the promise of Jesuit education, which said those things, that faith and reason are not at odds at each other. And so how do we kind of create and construct educational learning environments in the classroom, in the laboratories, in the studios, as well as in the residence facilities and all the spaces in between where that type of interaction might happen. With a few years into my role, I was fortunate to be appointed as the university's inaugural Chief Diversity and Community Engagement Officer, and under then Father Stephen Prevet, he had both the imagination and a vision around how the university, as the oldest institution of higher education in the city and county of San Francisco, might better fulfill our, both our duty and obligation around these ideas of equity and inclusion, and to take the university's mission, and to use it as a platform for good, but also to say that, you know what, we don't have it all figured out yet, and how might we, through our engagement with students as well as with the community, find out how we might understand more from our educational mission and the community to do better. And so my response, and the way that I have been a facilitator of change, is using all that we have available to us as educators, as particularly as Jesuit educators, to say that we have an opportunity to take all these people, an intergenerational education environment, from young developmental, you know, from the 18-year-olds to 25-year-olds to the next age group, and then we have people that are over 40 and 50 and 60 plus. How do we kind of create a space that is in very much likened to what you described, yet at the same time knowing that we are going to take them as they are, and at the same time knowing that 4 or 5 years later, that we have both an opportunity to form them, to help them to understand that there is ongoing formation that is happening. And so this work of Jesuit education is really about taking a student in, helping the student to see their full identities and the spectrums of their identities and the ways that those identities intersect and interlock and inform themselves, and then take that and present them with some ideas around, so what does it mean to be the one in a corporate boardroom someday and have both the privilege and the responsibility to stand up for an issue or a person or a group that is marginalized and vulnerable? And what does that look like if you happen to be a graduate of the School of Management? And what does that look like if you happen to be a biologist? And what does that look like if you happen to be have finished our teacher education, urban education program? Or what does that look like if you happen to be in the performing arts program? And so that is the question that we really kind of push the students to think about, regardless whether they are going to be entrepreneurs or they're going to go in the public sector and go work for a municipality and try to do good in that space. That they have a duty and an obligation to put at the center those whose voices, those whose experiences, and those whose outcomes have been on the periphery of society. And we teach that across all of our disciplines, in the School of Management, in the School of Law, in the School of Education, the School of Nursing and Health Professions. What are the healthcare inequities? What are the greatest healthcare inequities today? And how might you, in your health profession, serve that need? And that really has been the work of Jesuit education today. That's what the work has been. And it's so clear that our work is not done. It's a powerful platform to do diversity work from. It's a powerful platform to offer this work and to do it in an educational framework that is grounded in a tradition that I think matters today, perhaps more than it did. Maybe it has always mattered, but in this particular time, at such a time as this, what I believe that what we can offer and what we're trying to do down on Turk Street and the other places and spaces that we are throughout San Francisco and other places in California, it matters. And every time I sit with, and I get a chance to talk to a group of students, I was with a group of our 1Ls, first-year law students. we had one of the most diverse law classes we've had in a number of years. The highest enrollment of African American and Latinx young people were in that incoming class, and they just want to do good. They just want to make a difference, and they're trying to figure it out, whether it's immigration law, whether they want to go in corporate law, civil rights. They really are trying to figure out how to use their degree for the better. So it's a great place to be, and I feel fortunate and grateful to be able to help to be a facilitator in that process with them.
You know, I love everything you said, and I hear two things, that you have a great respect for the student as the student,
Yes.
for the humanity of that person, whoever they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you've got a hope that they can develop from
Yes.
that point to something else.
Absolutely.
That is not as common as we would like it to be. There are elite universities that the profile of the student body is quite important to keep the money flowing, so that you know, you can buy the student body you want,
Yeah.
if you, depending on what you have, and it could be the highest entrance scores on the one hand, or it could be
Yeah.
the person. And I think you're investing in something really beautiful.
Well, we're trying to do our best. You know, we always have areas to grow because it's not an inexpensive institution to
Right.
attend, and so that's both the
It's a challenge.
the challenging and side of the education that we're attempting to deliver and promise. That it is a high touch. And oftentimes a high cost experience, but nonetheless, we continue to move forward on it.
It's also interesting that you're part of this actually vast network of
Yes.
Jesuit colleges.
It's
and
actually the
universities.
largest educational network in the world. Most
Which
people
is-
don't know it.
And that's a great gift. It makes you an international body.
It is. There's almost 200 Jesuit universities worldwide across all the continents, and there's 28 here in the United States of America, including like Georgetown and Seattle U and Santa Clara and Loyola, and all the Loyolas are ours as well. I'm just,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Dr. Jiwa. Islamic studies is among the newer discipline areas at the Graduate Theological Union. In a wider climate that has mischaracterized and at times demonized Islam and brought danger, violence, and death to Muslims, what are the challenges of promoting peace, genuine peace, in the interfaith environment of the GTU?
Thank you for that
I know that wasn't
softball.
It was.
It was a great question. Thank you. Yeah. And I just want to thank everyone for being here, and also the organizers. Aaron, I just have a profound appreciation for all that you do. And just may all our work thrive together. So just a shout out. Thank you.
Absolutely.
No, I think it's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. So the Center for Islamic Studies was inaugurated in 2007 at the Graduate Theological Union. So for those of you who might not know the GTU, we're in Berkeley on the north side of campus, and it's a consortium of several seminaries, mostly Christian, and one that's UU that identifies as multi-religious. And then we have several centers, Center for Jewish Studies, Center for Dharma Studies, Institute of Buddhist Studies, and Center for Theology and Natural Sciences, Center for Arts and Education. And in 2007, we inaugurated the Center for Islamic Studies, which is an academic center where we were hopeful, and it's going well, that it would attract students in Islamic studies. We were also hoping that those students might be Muslim students, but it is an academic center for the study of Islam, which is in an interfaith environment where practice of faith matters. So not all our students are necessarily Muslim,
Right.
and not all of our students are necessarily practicing, but they are in an interreligious environment where one is exposed to religious practice and faith. So it's an amazing environment. If it's supposed to happen anywhere, that's it. So it was good thinking on GTU's part. The difficulties are that historically we haven't really had places besides university settings where Islamic studies is taught confessionally. So what does it mean to actually teach Islamic studies as an academic area in a kind of largely confessional environment? So there are kind of, and largely very liberal religious, confessionally religious environment as a GTU. So some of the challenges are along the lines of how do you do an academic study? A lot of people there want to know what Muslims think and how do you practice, and so practice of faith issues, even though we're an academic center, there's a lot of interest in that. So the challenge has been how do you balance the academic study of a discipline with practice of faith issues, and how is that different from, say, a university setting?
Right.
And public and private universities, of course, have different boundaries around how you teach religion, right? So teaching about religion or teaching religion, there's a difference in that. But the largest area I think we've been challenged by is that even those students who are coming to do their kind of classical Islamic studies, or they want to just do Quranic studies, they just want to be in their texts like a lot of other students get to be, they're usually met with a lot of interest in sort of what's going on in the world today. So political Islam, Islam in the contemporary world, and I think rightly so in some ways. They don't always feel qualified to respond, but I think that that's one of the challenges. I often have spoken about, and forgive me for those who may have heard this, we don't generally know the five...
Some things bear repeating.
Okay, thank you. The 5 pillars of Islam, we might not know, but the 5 media pillars of Islam, I think we all get to know, and I had the honor of giving the homily at the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples earlier today, so I mentioned it there. But these, what I call the 5 media pillars of Islam is generally the way in which the media frame how we come to think about Islam and Muslims in the world today. So 9/11 being the kind of temporal frame, even though that erases the long history of Islam and Muslims in the Americas. As Sylviane Diouf and many other scholars have shown, up to 20%, there are different estimates, anywhere from 10 to 30%, but 20% of those Africans who were enslaved in the Americas were Muslim, right? And so this idea that Islam is sort of just, it kind of comes to the public sphere after 9/11, erases that long history of Islam as an established religion, especially amongst African Americans in this country. The second frame is the frame that we're probably most familiar with around terrorism, violence. So I argue, words like jihad, al-Qaeda, Taliban, burqa, madrasa, these are all English words. They don't come up as errors. You don't need to spell check them in English. I mean, these are all the ways in which, sort of Muslims and Islam enter our studies, but are also our larger public sphere. And the thing about I can get back to the violence part, but the third frame is around Muslim women, gender, sexuality, and this kind of that Islamic patriarchy is somehow more patriarchal than other forms of patriarchy, right? That it's particularly the Muslim world that has this problem. So, and then also conversations, debates around veiling and Muslim women's choices. So that seems to be an area that we constantly hear about, and the so-called oppressed Muslim woman. And I think that image is sort of shifting now with the Me Too movement. We've seen Muslim women lead in a lot of these marches. But also another example is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, right? She's no longer she's not oppressed because she's the poor Muslim woman who's oppressed by her fellow Muslim males, but she's actually oppressed because she's speaking out.
Yes.
So there has been a shift in how we think about women and gender in this larger thing. The fourth frame is the frame of Islam and the West. So again, the idea that Islamic values are incompatible with Western values. and that, again, it forgets the long history of Islam in the West, right? Whether we're talking about African American history here, whether we're talking about Bosnians in Europe, that there's a long history of Islam in the West, and that Islamic history, Christian histories, these are messy, but they overlap and they're mutually constitutive. So we can't actually think about these histories only in their specificities. We need to think of them as overlapping. And then the last frame is the frame of the Middle East. We often think about Islam and Muslims largely through the region of the Middle East. So if 9/11 becomes a temporal category, the Middle East becomes the kind of geographic zone. And you know, it's most Muslims live outside of the Middle East. The largest are in South Asia as a region. Largest Muslim majority country is Indonesia. So it's you know, and when you think of Middle East, you know, it's usually around politics, oil, terrorism, violence, right? It's not. I mean, sometimes it's around the kind of Disneyland, Dubai things, but or historically Orientalist fantasies around the Middle East. But by and large, it's political. It's around Israel, Palestine. It's around the current wars throughout the region. So a lot of the challenges that we face in, and I think there are these challenges provide opportunities for dialogue. So the wonderful thing about the GTU is that as you're challenged with these or you're met with these kinds of questions, that you also have the opportunity to address them, to address the issues in class. And a lot of our work is publicly engaged. So most of our students, even those who are the most textual of scholars, are somehow publicly engaged. And it's an intentional part of our program that if you're working on Islamic art and you're looking at a beautiful illustrated manuscript, that it somehow connects to the world. So that student will also be connected to maybe the Asian Art Museum or BAM PFA. If you're working on African American history, that it's connected to those communities. If you're working on social justice issues, that there's a practical side. So I think that a lot of our challenges are I mean, it's a privilege in some ways to be able to have such a space to be able to kind of sort out some of these, and also serves as a kind of microcosm of what can happen in the world. Yeah.
Well, I think those 5 media pillars are brilliant. And I don't know if all of you are familiar with the GTU, but it is unique in the United States. There's nothing like it. And the fact that everybody can cross-list each other's classes, and it's one library. It's not a bunch of different libraries. So by giving them these pillars as frames, you're giving them a challenge to encounter reality from all these different religious perspectives. That's really fantastic. I want to get to questions that come from all of you who have so kindly come. But I've got one. I prepared many questions, so I had one for each of you. But I've got one. Well, I'm just going to pick one that is free for all. Whichever of you responds, and then I'd be very happy if you responded to each other. As you write, because you're amazing people. And then we'll move to questions from here. Is that good?
Thank you.
Okay. Let me just. Okay, I don't know. The contrast between peace and obnoxious peace implies something about the role of truth in the work we do for peace. Really being rather than seeming to be. Esse quam videre. It feels like we are living in a time of a full-on assault on truth. How do you see the relation between truth, justice, and peace today? What is the role of faith bodies today in promoting this nexus of truth, justice, and peace?
Well, when I think about truth, I feel like it's, I have a functional work title, it's called Chief Diversity Officer, and people say, what is that work all about? Well, I said, well, actually, it's about telling the truth, and helping people, engage in confronting some things we may have learned about ourselves and what we might actually have to disrupt and unlearn, and then perhaps relearn some new things. Because, we're in the learning institution. And so one of the things, I even say this to new employees, new faculty, and new staff, that you might actually need to unlearn some things in order to be able to be in this community in which we are attempting to kind of create a beloved community of scholars and people that have come together. And so I think truth is at the heart of what equity work is today. If you're an equity worker, whatever it is that you do, you are asking people to excavate, to do some interior work, to do some examination of our beliefs and our values, to test them out a little bit more, to challenge our attitudes and our behaviors in ways that we haven't before. And truth work is also courageous work, And I always tell folks that all I know is that we're presented with a lot of problems, and there's various solutions in society, but I can usually find the simplest response to whatever an issue is by staying as close as I can to an individual who has had the least opportunity, who has had the least, advantage, who is the one that has the least privileged, and all of us folks that are so privileged in life are usually the ones that do not have the right answers. Wow. And so I always share with my students, I said, pay attention to in your work, regardless of your field, regardless of your job, it doesn't matter. In the future, pay attention to the one that you would think is the least of these in the context of whatever it is that you're doing. I said, that's where truth lies.
And stay close to that.
And stay
person.
close to that.
I
Stay
love
close
that.
to those
Beautiful.
people. Stay close to the voices of those that are the most marginalized.
Yeah.
Stay closest to the experiences of those who are on the periphery. Stay close to those who often are at the bottom. That's the reason why, I'm known on campus. I'm actually one of the most beloved administrators because I like to get in there with people across positionality and spend time with people because I know that's where the stories are that will help transform the institution so we can actually live the mission that we say that we care about. So truth is actually on the periphery and the places that we're not looking at. It's embodied in the people that have the least of these experiences.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
It really is. Yes. Beautiful. Yeah. There can be no true peace until subjugated people and their knowledge and their experiences are incorporated in and deepened within our own society. Gus Newport, former mayor of Berkeley, says, for example, there's no really American history, it's American propaganda. And that's what we've been told. The history that we have been taught is propaganda, is a view from the conquerors, from the exploited, from the empire.
Right.
And until we hear and create the kind of atmosphere where these subjugated people can feel as though they can speak their truth, there will not be truth. Now, one of the things about Martin Luther King is he did not wait for that to be created. He had to speak his truth, period. And especially when you look at his Beyond Vietnam speech,
Absolutely.
he spoke his truth and was vilified for it. The press condemned him. Even liberal civil rights organizations condemned him. So he did not wait for that to be created. And sometimes we cannot wait to create. We just have to speak. That's why Audre Lorde talks about your silence will not save you. We must speak, and the time for speaking is now. Otherwise, it is obnoxious, the peace we have, and it isn't true. And I say, and that is our reality. I don't mean just the person in the White House and the people around. That is our reality.
Our reality.
Our reality, as liberals, progressive, whatever, we still are not hearing and responding to the truth of subjugated people and subjugated voices.
And even,
it's a kind of toleration.
I think the really challenging thing in what you're saying, Dr. Blake, is not just hearing them, but incorporating them into
Absolutely.
Yes,
leadership.
that has to be part of it.
Yeah, their voices, their stories have to be put at the center.
Put in
Has
the
to be the
center.
center of all of our
Yeah.
policy making. It has to be put at the center of any institution building that we're doing, initiatives, how we go about allocating budgets and spaces. That is the transformative work that truth actually provides a pathway to. But it takes a lot of courage for leaders to do that work. It takes a lot of courage for boards of trustees and the management
Yes.
and all the people, that make up institutions. I mean, I'm an institution worker to do that. And so that is really the work of today is finding folks that have enough courage
Yes.
to go forward to do that work. And there's so much confusion and as well as strife in the world right now, that now is the time for any leader, regardless of whatever he, she, or they do, that the door is wide open to do truth work.
And truth work has to, we need to create different structures for truth work because some of our structures and institutions will not allow truth work
I know.
at all. And I think it's important for us to also understand that most of our institutions, our structures, are built by dead people. People who are now dead. And yet we spend all of our lives trying to fit into the structures that these dead people created. You know? Even when we go back to the impeachment process and we talk about the Constitution, well, the Constitution was put together by whom? Are they around now? Their circumstances were different. So even we have to look at that and say, well, maybe we need something different from what we're talking about, that our founding fathers. Well, who were our founding fathers? People who discriminated against women, people, Native Americans, black, this kind of thing. So, and that takes a lot of courage. It takes courage to go against institutions. Sometimes it's okay to bring in people on an individual level, but when you, again, King, when you start saying that my nation is the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, when you start talking about the military-industrial complex must go, when you talk about the whole structure of American society has to be changed, you got to go.
Yeah.
Well, that's why Vincent Harding called him an inconvenient hero.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Jiwa.
Yeah, just, beautiful, what we've heard so far. And I was just thinking about what it means to speak truth to power.
Yes.
Right? And the late Edward Said, those of us in academia and beyond, learned so much from him in terms of how important it is to keep speaking our truths. In the Islamic tradition, justice is adala is actually tied to goodness and the good society, but also to do what is hasana, to strive for excellence, to do what is beautiful. So these are intertwined things as I see them, as well as that they are intertwined with diversity. So the often recited Quranic verse on diversity that all of us love to keep reciting is that God says, "O humankind, we created you of a male and female nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Surely the noblest of you in the sight of God is the one who is most God-conscious," right? And part of this, so the Arabic in that of getting to know one another, lita'arafu is a reciprocal. Even the verb itself in Arabic takes the form of reciprocity. So it is one in which my truth is tied to you, my being is tied to you, my sense of justice in the world is intertwined. It's too late for anyone who thinks that we work as isolated individuals. And I think the amazing work of Dr. King, Dr. Thurman, who's a mentor, who I actually learned about through King, but the one thing that they lift up over and again is our mutuality, interconnectedness.
Yes.
And I think that once we start seeing that, and once we remember that as a constant in our lives, we start recognizing that our sense of justice for ourselves is directly related to another's justice.
Absolutely.
And that's why keep hearing, injustice, justice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. Right, yeah.
You know, our dean knows this so well. Emerson is the one who said that cosmos is also the word for beauty. So it's complex and interconnected, and that's what makes it beautiful. And the cosmos, we get cosmetics from the same word. And there's something really important in that, right? The cosmos is so beautiful because it is so diverse. It is the ultimate diversity. And it's also completely integrated. And that's what makes it beautiful.
It's still evolving.
And that's what, so Bergson said that's the definition of evolution, is that it's both getting more complex and getting more integrated at the same time. Not one or the other.
Right.
But we can't talk about time for justice without talking about white supremacy
Okay.
in America.
Go for it.
And I just think that there is really an invitation that has always been there. But I think that as we go into this next decade and this time in 2020, I think that all people of good intention and moral grounding are really being pressed to make a decision about what they might do around the ways in which our country has had cyclical, persistent, and consistent inequality and inequity. And it doesn't matter what neighborhood you live in. It doesn't matter what state you live in. It just is a matter of what area code you live in. It determines how far someone is impacted by it. And this whole idea of white silence is actually violence. I think that particularly people involved in the interfaith movement, people that are involved, in the faith movements, there is and I consider my institution one of those. It's the University of San Francisco. It's a Jesuit and Catholic institution. So I say this on campus to people as well, that there is a higher duty right now, not necessarily for me as a Black executive woman in higher education. I mean, I've been doing this work for a long time. But there's a higher duty of my white colleagues to use their unearned advantage for purpose of justice and doing right in the world.
Yes.
And they have to find
I agree, yes.
they have to find their place in it. They have to find it. That if our societies, both locally, in the state and nationally, are going to see any gains in this decade, we have to have very honest and unwavering conversations around the construct of what white supremacy is and how it has impacted everything. Yes. There is not a system, there is not an institution, there is not an environment that it is not a part of. And we got to get athletic, we got to get stronger about it. We got to get muscles to be able to deal with it so we don't shy away from it. And we got to talk about, the ways in which racism and the ways in which Islamophobia and the ways in which religious persecution and the ways in which we treat members from the LGBTQ communities and the ways that all of those interlocking issues are at the heart of us not becoming who we want to be. And so there just has to be a lot more that we do around that. I think in the last 10 years, we really have gotten a sense of just saying that you're a part of a group or locating yourself in an issue was enough. That work actually has to go much further. It has to be, a responsibility of the individual in an everyday way in which he, she, or they make a commitment to work, to be an anti-racist, to work against anti-black racism, to work against anti-indigenous, racism, which are always good places to start, because if you work with those two, then you can work against all the other isms. And really make a commitment and really see that now is not the time to be silent. Now is not the time to be apathetic, and that you can find your place in this work just as you are, with whatever experiences you are, and that is enough.
Yeah, I so appreciate you bringing that up. I notice this every time reparations is brought up, the resistance in the white community to it won't work, I see it there. And I'll take a point of personal privilege. I've taken those tests where you're in the room and you do who's the most privileged person in the room. I'm always at the top. And I'm aware of that. There was a black bishop I went to Uganda with in 1989. We spent a month in Uganda. And on the long trip there, he told me that he was directly descended from one of the small group of Africans brought in 1619.
Wow.
To Jamestown. And I am descended, this is the 400th anniversary of my family coming to Jamestown as an indentured servant. So we both started as slaves, but because my ancestor was white, he was freed in 7 years, given property, and I'm now the Bishop of California. It would have been a different outcome for his family. So thank you. It's hard work, and it is everywhere, and we have to do it.
We have to do it, because this whole forum, the reason why we're having a conversation is actually grounded in that work.
It's grounded in that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca.
Wow.
Okay. Oh, I think I'll take the shorter one first. Thank you. Thinking about justice in the context of this year with an impeachment and a presidential race. Short doesn't mean easier. What gives you hope? Let me read it again. Thinking about justice in the context of this year with an impeachment and a presidential race. What gives you hope?
Well, I'm always hopeful because I've made it my life's mission to work in an educational context, whether where I'm at now, whether it's the San Francisco Public Library, which is the most democratic learning institution in the city, to take my gifts, talents, and abilities and the privileges that I have of my education experience and to be a servant in those spaces and places that provide learning opportunities and provide access. Because of the developmental processes and the formation processes that happens in learning institutions, when you see what happens with individuals, you cannot help but be hopeful. And so, as I said before, every time I go in and talk to a group of students, whether they are at the beginning of their journey or at the end of their journey, I'm always hopeful because I know that that investment will bear itself out in some way that I have to believe is going to be good for the world.
Dr. Thurman said that the contradictions of life are neither final nor ultimate. So what we experience is not final, not ultimate. And he also said we all have the right to choose. To choose the things for which we will work for, and to choose the things for which we will work against. I have to be hopeful, because without that sense of hope, I could not go forward. And the hope is based upon the fact that when I go back to my ancestors, the enslaved people, when I look at the circumstances under which they lived, unbelievable circumstances, there was this element of hope that allowed them to keep on keeping on. A hope that was even more profound than death, because they realized people were dying, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord. That means that there is an alternative. There's an alternative life. I have to hope because, well, number one, I'm constantly giving reminders about people whose lives have been changed, who are moving toward involving us in reaching what is called a, I don't want to use the word promised land anymore because that's loaded with some, especially I look at the Middle East now and Palestine. But I am, for example, just this past week, I taught in the doctor of ministry program at Pacific School of Religion. The doctor of ministry program, you're talking ministers basically who are doing various projects at their churches or elsewhere to bring about social transformation. And when I left that week, I said, my God, there is hope. Because these are people who are saying it's got to change. Things have got to, they cannot remain the way they are. What's that?
They're devoting themselves
and
to
they're devoting themselves to the change.
Right. They're not just talking about it.
No, they've got projects that they're working on. And so when I leave that classroom, or when I have a classroom, not even doctor of ministry students, but the master's students, and you feel you engage in conversation, and it clicks at one point, that's the only reason I can teach. I cannot teach if I cannot have a sense of hope that my teaching makes a difference. I couldn't do that. So, and I cannot preach without giving people some sense of hope if they have a responsibility to bring about hope.
If I can just also add, what gives me hope is that I think increasingly we are seeing ourselves intersectionally. Right? That my oppression is tied to yours,
Absolutely.
and I need to work for yours as you need to work for mine. So I think that there's a larger sense of that, and a larger sense of ourselves as being part of a larger world, not just America, but being global. That as seeing ourselves in that way, I think is a break from what we often see as the reason why the state gets afraid or tries to clamp down on voices that seem unpatriotic is because they're often relating their oppressions internationally. So if we look at Dr. King's Vietnam speech, right? The fear was people will start making the connections between the racism at home and the wars abroad.
Right. Absolutely.
And internationalizing our politics and our belonging and our sense of solidarity threatens us at home. And that's why we have sort of the loyalty tests of how American are you. Obama was put through that, right? Barack Hussein Obama, closet Muslim. Partly because he wasn't seen as American enough. We were trying to point to his internationalness, his otherness, as a sign of weakness rather than as a sign of something we should be celebrating. Right?
Weakness or something to be feared.
Feared, absolutely. Something to be feared.
Maybe
right.
too strong.
Yeah.
you know.
No, but the fact that it was like you're not patriotic enough
Yeah,
at
not
home,
patriotic
right?
enough.
And
But that is
so-
part of it, if
yeah.
I can say this is fair.
Yeah.
The other thing is, we have never had as many people as we have now all across the world who are opposed to war.
Yeah.
Or who understand the oppression and want to do something about it. The question, how do you organize that?
There you go.
So it becomes an organism, you know, a real organism of change and so on.
True, and yet I look at organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the training for nonviolence, and it seems very much a minority voice right now to me. I'm not without hope, but I do think that it seems muted right now. But
Maybe that particular organization.
no, I mean,
Yes.
more broadly than just FOR. But that's another conversation.
Yeah.
We have what time, I hope, for one more question.
Oh.
Well, I'm sorry, but there's several that have come in on the same theme. So I'm gonna use one to represent several. When considering the economic challenges the less than wealthy and the poor face, challenges King explored and where do we go from here, which we had as our theme 3 years ago. How does this panel respond to the ambition of the Jubilee to invest every citizen in the land? Specifically, should one person and another be able to charge another for access to God's creation, including the land under San Francisco? So this was a question echoed by several people about climate justice and its relationship to other forms of justice, racial justice and gender justice. So it's a really a climate justice question.
Could you just repeat that?
Yeah.
Yeah. When considering the economic challenges the less than wealthy and the poor face, challenges King explored in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? How does this panel respond to the ambition of the concept in the Hebrew Scriptures of the Jubilee, which is a time of erasing debt, and giving the land, specifically here I think it's a reference to Leviticus where the Hebrew people are enjoined to give the land a rest so that it can worship God itself. So I think that's the reference here. Specifically, should one person and another be able to charge another for access to God's creation as if we own it, owners, including the land under San Francisco? I think a reference to indigenous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, lonely land.
There's a lot in this question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, what I'm trying to understand from it is that how do we, as people who have been able to live on this land, which is, was originally the Ohlone land that we all are on at this moment, and with the ways in which the structures of who gets to have what, the structure of the United States, the structure of private property versus public lands. And with the gross inequities that we have among peoples because of the ways that that system was not set up equitably in the first place. Not everybody has access equitably to education, as well as health care, as well as economic education, economics. And so now we are faced with a situation in which there's always going to be just a few, whatever that few is, that has ownership and oversight of all of everything. And I think so much of the answer has to do with our capacity to reconcile with our own ways in which we have left people behind, and to figure out how can we, as cities, but as societies, look at some of the spaces in which we do have public, that's in the public realm, and to think differently about those spaces.
The commons.
The commons, yeah. I think there's opportunity with the commons to think differently about that.
Water is one of those places.
Absolutely, water is one of those things. I'm not sure how to, I don't have anything to offer around the way that we have structured as a society the private lands and the way that is currently, divvied up.
I think that's actually
It's-
enormously helpful what you've just said, because the Episcopal Church passed a resolution in 2018 on water as a common right.
Yeah.
And that is not obvious to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's a utility for which people are charged, but we can't live without it.
Yes.
And access to clean water should be a human right.
It should be a human right.
So I think pointing us, as you just did, to that which is common,
Yes.
upon which all of life depends, and starting there.
That's a place to start.
Start there.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Yes.
It can't happen under our present capitalistic system.
Yeah.
It can't. So that's the basic understanding we need to have. It can't happen. King, in one of his things talks about, why do you have to pay for water when the earth is 2/3 there for water?
Yeah.
Okay. He also said, and I think this is very important, in a letter he wrote to Coretta Scott before they became married, he talked about his disillusionment with the capitalistic system and said it had lost its usefulness. In that letter, he also said to her, I think we have to move toward a democratic socialism. 1952. Again, the structures have got to change. It cannot happen when the basis of your system is greed. When the basis of your system is exploitation.
Yeah.
When the basis of your system is disrespect for other people. King also said in that letter how awful it was that we extract from the least of these to give to the luxury of the rich. And that is part of the reality of it. So when you're talking about Jubilee and paying back, giving back, it's not going to happen with the mentality that we have that is endemic to capitalism. It's just not
Well,
going to happen.
I totally agree with you, and extraction is a mode that transcends.
Yes.
It's not just capitalism.
I agree with
right?
that.
It was
I agree with
monarchy
that.
before that, and it was monarchy for 10,000 years.
Yes. So that might have been, I hear what you're saying there, but I'm saying now we've had
Now
capitalism
we've
for
got
us
it,
in
right,
years,
yeah.
and it's exploitative.
It
And there's
is.
no way of getting
Totally.
around that.
Ta-
And it does not take in, Jubilee is a very spiritual idea,
Yeah.
concept. It's also one that deals with economic realities.
It does.
And those economic realities are in opposition
To the principles of capitalism.
Yeah.
That's all.
I'm going to give Dr. Jiwa a chance to respond, and then I'll turn to you.
I'm thinking about this in two different ways. One is, Dr. King and many others, Malcolm X. I mean, you've seen it in the sort of black intellectual and spiritual traditions in, of course, the U.S., but all over the world, where there's a link between sort of our wars and poverty.
Absolutely.
Right? And that there are many things that Dr. King has written on this, but and it was mentioned earlier today in the service about the fact that I think it was 8 people have the wealth of
Yes.
I don't know how many 50%. 50% of the world. So there's this gross inequity, and I just want to put this out there. I have my own critiques of this, but this idea that we now live in the Anthropocene, that we live in an age where we're now not only just interconnected as human beings, but we're also connected to the environment in ways that we've forgotten about and coming back to, because the environment is yelling at us, is screaming at us, is asking us to pay attention. And there's a different kind of connectedness that we now have that we're coming back to, which indigenous peoples and many others have been have upheld and which we have sort of forgotten and now coming back to. So one of the images I have in my head is a few years ago at the GTU, we did an event that my dear colleague in Jewish Studies, Dr. Naomi Seidman, who's now at University of Toronto, we did a program called Earthlings. And it was, in a way, to reimagine ourselves as those who have been granted, in the Islamic tradition, we say, you know, vicegerents on earth, that we're here to do God's work and to keep the earth holy. And this idea that if we thought of ourselves as earthlings, how would that change or add to the ways in which we see ourselves through our very particular identities? So it's not either or, but what shifts for us if I don't just think of myself as a Canadian, Kenyan-born, third-generation African of Indian origin who lives in the US, but I think of myself as an earthling, connected to other beings, plants, flowers, other human beings, the mountains. I mean, it forces us to think about the world in a very different way,
Very different.
right? And to again think of ourselves through that interconnectedness, not at the expense again of our individual identities, but that we come to our collective identities through our individual histories.
So one of the brilliances of this friend of Dr. King's that I'm studying, Thich Nhat Hanh, he wrote a beautiful letter, it's a poem, to the earth, and he calls the earth a great bodhisattva.
Yes.
So he calls several living women, human women, great bodhisattvas, which is a new thing in certain parts of Buddhism, and he calls the earth a great bodhisattva. So when you start to think that way, it changes your frame. So there's the last word. Thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you.